in this 5-year plan, as we understand it, there will be a huge amount of attention devoted to artificial intelligence. And actually, this plan is being called AI Plus by the Chinese government.
Well, China's view towards Europe seems getting much hardened in the recent years, and Beijing still firmly views its relationship with Europe through the lenses on its competition with the United States.
How much the political difficulty in the moment in Europe, some of the economic difficulty as well I'm thinking of, do you think is caused by these Chinese decisions about how to try and get its products into the world? And do you think China cares about those strains? Hello again. Welcome to Independent Thinking, the international affairs podcast from Chatham House. I'm Bronwen Maddox. It's 5-year plan, time again in China. To be precise, the 4th plenum of the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party is underway in Beijing this week. It is behind closed doors, but has no shortage of drama. It's supposed to set out the 5-year plan for national economic and social development, but there have also been HR issues, as one of my colleagues calls them. On the eve of the meeting, the Communist Party announced an unprecedented purge of 9 top generals, many of them part of the Central Committee. There are questions even about Chinese leader Xi Jinping and his longevity in that post. Well, joining me to shed light on all of this are 2 senior research fellows with our Asia-Pacific programme. Dr. Yu Jie deals with Chinese foreign policy and economic diplomacy. James Kynge has written for many decades for the Financial Times and others about China, has also written a book about China's drive to dominate the global tech race. Welcome to you both. Yu Jie, let's plunge straight in. I mean, it's relatively easy to know what's going on in the White House, especially now they've taken down one wall of the East Wing so we can see inside. That's for Trump's ballroom. But the Chinese Communist Party is not quite so transparent. What is this meeting and what's going on?
I think for any political party or any organization, usually have 2 issues prompt you. One is on HR and the other one is on finance. And that's precisely the so-called 4th plenum is going to deal with it and still dealing with right now. And we're going to be expecting a result come by this Friday. So this is the 4 days gathering of around 200 people of the so-called Central Committee members of the Chinese Communist Party. And they are the second most important tier of the decision-making body within China. And usually the members consist of politicians, corporate lawyers, local governors, even including former Olympic champions at the same time. And obviously, for this particular gathering, they are dealing with the 5-year plan. So what China is going to do in the next 5 years between 2026 until 2030. And then also that would including some very important HR issues, cabinet shuffles, and personnel changes within President Xi's cabinet.
We'll come on to some of those because calling them HR issues makes it sound very managerial and entirely under control, and that may not be entirely the case. It's got a very long name, though, doesn't it? I'm calling it very briskly the 4th plenum.
To specify in Chinese, is 中共中央20届中央委员会第4次全体会议. That's the full name of the 4th plenum. Now,
that means exactly what?
That means exactly the Central Committee convened the 4th time from 2022 onward. So the 4th plenary.
As it says on the tin.
Exactly. I think it's really a piece of political theater that enabled many China watchers around the world to observe, and most notably, and who are present in that meeting, in the meeting room, and even more importantly, who did not show up and why did not show up, including some, as I said earlier, former generals and from the PLA and commanders-in-chief, some local provincial governors, and who not been presidented, of course, as a result of their wrongdoings, as a result of the political purge, but also as a result of the so-called anti-corruption campaign launched by Xi Jinping when he came to power back to 13 years ago.
So this reflects who's in and who's out.
Most importantly, to counting who are not there and compare with the previous meeting, which took place in July last year.
Absolutely fascinating. So all these faces, if you like, in that portrait, some with a sort of dark circle. James, you're a China watcher. How do you look at this?
I actually think that this plenum is going to be crucially important. In fact, I might even use the word historic. And the reason for that is AI. Obviously, this is the plenum where all of these 200 people are going to be talking about the 5-year plan. The 5-year plan will be announced next spring. But in this 5-year plan, as we understand it, there will be a huge amount of attention devoted to artificial intelligence. And actually, this plan is being called AI Plus by the Chinese government. And if I just sketch out the ambition here, I think we can see the unbelievable trajectory that the Chinese Communist Party wants to point the country in. And that is, it wants to infuse AI applications into 6 crucial areas. One is science and technology. Another one is industrial production. Another one is consumption. Another one is the quality of life and the governance, and also global cooperation. So I don't think it's an overestimate to say China basically wants to move to an AI-animated economy and society by 2030. That's what this 5-year plan, to me, is all about.
So huge ambition. What can you, looking at this plan, actually tell that is new, if you like? Because China has made many ambitious comments about its intentions in AI. When you read this, or when you look at what is likely to come out, what do you deduce that is new?
To me, it's the energy that the Chinese Communist Party is putting behind finding applications for AI. And I think in this regard, it's really crucially different from the United States. This is perhaps an oversimplification, but people portray the US as going for the moonshot, going for the AGI, Advanced General Intelligence, something where a state where machines can train themselves. It's sort of escape velocity for AI. But in China, the approach is very, very different. China wants to make money out of AI. It wants to use AI, harness AI to make scientific breakthroughs.
So it's talking about new drugs, pharmaceuticals, antibiotics, all this kind of thing.
Absolutely. New drugs, new robots, new lunar modules. It wants everything to be animated by AI in order to increase efficiency and increase, return on investment.
Including defense?
And including defense, absolutely. I mean, there are so many examples. Some of them are quite cute. I can go into them if you like.
I wouldn't mind a few examples because applications is mysteriously abstract.
Okay, so let me give you an example. There's a Chinese humanoid robot company called Unitree. And the breakthrough, it might have been last week, it might have been the week before, was that it's created this humanoid robot powered by AI that can leap into the air, do a 360-degree spin, and land on its feet. This is something that we can all see on YouTube at the moment. That's all entirely done with AI. The other one I'd point to is last year, actually, China sent a mission to the dark side of the moon. This is called the Chang'e number 6 mission. And the lunar module landed on the dark side of the moon. And then it had a smaller little cardboard box size module that went out from the lunar module, picked up some Earth and some other samples from the dark side of the moon, and then turned around and took a selfie of itself and the big Chinese Chang'e lunar module behind it. All of that, the entire mission was animated by AI. So this is the type of future that we're moving into. And it's quite extraordinary, the pace at which China's going.
Do you recognize that this is something very, very different from, say, 5 years ago?
It's substantively different from 5 years ago. That is to say, much of the economic planning, it is not about economic planning anymore. It's more about economic security planning. How China can withstand the geopolitical pressure brought by the United States, and also how China can survive in this very painful and perhaps also protracted trade war with the other side of the Pacific. Beijing will have to try to find that precarious balance between the economic security on the one hand, but also on the other hand, even more importantly, how to generate prosperity. I mean, James, I can get very excited about lunar landing on certain things, but I cannot get very excited when it comes to such a skyrocket high youth employment number. So I believe the 5 years plan will have to deal with these basic economic questions from the start
and
as
you put
well.
your finger on it. I mean, there's 2 blocks of problems there. One, the problems that China and its economy have had for some years now growing, and particularly in the provinces, and the debt and so on, and the unemployment. And then the Trump shock, the new tariffs and so on that have issued forth from the White House. How much do you expect this plan to deal explicitly with these?
I mean, obviously, the plan, what we receive by this Friday, will only be a draft. And the more details will be panned out in the matter of 6 months' time. By March, we should have a full picture. However, one signal which I shall take is whether by Friday they're going to announce that between the next 5 years, Beijing would like to keep its GDP growth around 4.5%. If anyone would specify that number at this very stage, it actually indicates the government is still very much concerned about its own economic growth. So give a bit of continuity in here.
James, what do you make of the old problems? And regardless of what this plenum says or doesn't say explicitly about them, whether China is actually in a position to tackle them, old problems and the Trump-flavored new problems?
Well, I mean, I think some of the old problems really come down to the sustainability of the China business model, because on the one hand, as we've just been talking about, China's creating this extraordinary technological superpower. But on the other hand, it is, to my mind anyway, failing to finance itself. In other words, corporate profits have been down every year for the last 3 years. The corporate tax take has been down, certainly last year. The budget deficit in China is rising to very high levels. There really is a question as to whether China can continue to finance this current economic model, which is so heavy on technology and investment and all of those things, and so light on creating demand within the economy. And so I think when it comes to the 5-year plan, I really will be looking very carefully to see whether there's any paragraphs, that are different from the past about China stimulating consumer demand. And this is also going to be crucial for the rest of the world because at the moment, China has, in my view, an unsustainably huge trade surplus. This year, China's trade surplus will exceed $1 trillion for the first time ever if current...
So this is the amount of goods that it is selling to the world much more than what it is importing.
Absolutely. And a lot of these goods increasingly are technology goods. So in many cases, the import of Chinese technology, such as electric vehicles, and I just mentioned robotics, solar panels, wind power, all of that kind of thing, are displacing existing products of Western companies that are being disrupted by China's tech rise. So the issue of whether or not the Chinese government can stimulate domestic consumption to, first of all, balance its economy, and secondly, to buy more stuff from abroad, from the West and from other countries, is really crucial. And
It's really crucial. Why? Because, from China's point of view, in very simple terms, doesn't it want the world to keep buying its stuff? And okay, now you've got the Trump wall of tariffs going up, which makes America distinctly less likely to buy its stuff. So it wants to shovel loads to Europe, among other places, and Europe now considering its own tariffs and so on to try and protect its own industries. So it's looking for markets for this. But what are its answers? It still wants the world to buy the stuff.
Absolutely. So this is the fundamental tension, I think, that lies behind the US-China trade war and the US-China tech war, and increasingly the trade tensions that we see between Europe and China. China, from its perspective, of course, it wants to export as much of this technology and products as it can. But is this sustainable from a European or American point of view? I think what we're seeing in America, the answer is clearly no. Or the Americans would like China to stimulate domestic demand and buy more from the West. And I think the same tensions are beginning to arrive in Europe as well. So, I sort of feel that the plan will be really crucial in as much as it gives foreigners, so that would be Europeans and Americans, a sense of where China's heading in terms of consumer demand. Because if China reflates its economy, reflates consumer demand, then maybe Europeans can start to rebalance the huge trade deficits that they have with China.
So let's use this as a reason to just come on explicitly and talk about what China's doing means for other countries. Eugenia, sorry, I interrupted you, about to come in on this point, particularly I think about China and Europe.
Well, China's view towards Europe seems getting much hardened in the recent years, and Beijing still firmly views its relationship with Europe through the lenses on its competition with the United States and whether Europeans, on which side European belongs to. And surely at this very moment, I think Europeans also try to find its own feet.
Europeans are sounding much harder, to use your word, about China than they would even 4 years ago. I'm thinking particularly of Germany, which has made huge investment literally for decades in China, but now very wary of China flooding the European market, getting rid of German industry in green technology. Maybe now James has been suggesting in-house, pharmaceuticals are next in the line of fire. And of course, you've got China's low-key support for Russia over Ukraine to worsen the relationship as well.
Obviously, with this 5 years plan in place, and we're probably going to see more frictions, not just with Europe, but also with other emerging economy, because ultimately, I think what China is trying to do is trying to use is a power of manufacturing turn it into a geopolitical power and to make the rest of the world become more dependent towards China, but make China equally less dependent on the rest of the world, and most notably in the West. I think that's the attitude Beijing is holding right now.
How much of the political difficulty in the moment in Europe, some of the economic difficulty as well, I'm thinking of, do you think is caused by these Chinese decisions about how to try and get its products into the world? And do you think China cares about those strains?
My sense of it is that there is what I call quiet panic running through the corridors of power in several European capitals. The quiet panic refers to the sense that the dragon is now on Europe's doorstep. In other words, world-beating Chinese technology companies are taking market share from European competitors, some of which are the biggest companies that we have in Europe, and they're doing so at a very rapid rate. Obviously, the example that everyone points to is electric vehicles, but there are many other sectors as well. The reason why the panic is quiet is because it's inconvenient for European governments to voice this out loud, because in many cases, Germany would be a prime example, their biggest companies are trying to access opportunities within China's market itself. And therefore, those big German companies are putting constraints on the German government from speaking out loud about the tensions that China's technological rise and its export march into Europe is creating. So you have a very curious dynamic right now of some of Europe's biggest companies being disrupted, and yet Europe's political response to this being fairly, I would say, weak so far, fairly insipid so far. And I don't know if that's going to change, but I have spoken to many officials within European capitals, and there is this palpable sense of anxiety about the rise of China as a technological power and the way that that is disrupting some of their companies.
I have to say, sitting in Britain, it doesn't feel quite so quiet in that the British government is in a quandary about how to respond to China, and it's got several big decisions, of which one, whether to buy wind turbines off China, is perhaps the most difficult, security and economic grounds. It's got the question about whether to give China the big embassy it wants, and it's got this row over the spy case that was dropped. But perhaps not quite as ambivalent as you've described the Europeans being, particularly the Germans, because Britain doesn't have so much of a domestic industry to defend, but it still has to weigh up security against growth. Does China care about these strains it's causing?
Well, of course it can, because European Union remain as one of the most important trading partner with China. But I think on the other hand, the strategy for Beijing in the recent decade has always been, I want to upgrade my own manufacturing export in order to generating extra revenue for channeling my own innovation and scientific innovation, so on and so forth. So I think, yes, Beijing acknowledges those problems. But on the other hand, I think by having this 5 years plan in place, and these problems will be even getting more exacerbated because of China's advanced manufacturing capabilities.
So let's pick up some aspects, particularly of the feud with Trump's America.
Sure.
And Trump's recent threat of tariffs, but also China's retaliation, saying that we're going to hold on to the critical minerals that we have such a lock on if you look at the world's supply. Where do you think that's going to go?
Well, it's unlikely to ease at any time soon. But if we are going to have some kind of trade framework between Beijing and Washington, if some good things happen during Xi-Trump meeting, which is likely to take place next week, and we might see some quota of the certain elements of rare earth being increased towards the United States as being part of the bargaining chip from Beijing to United States, something that Beijing can offer to United States. However, I think over the longer term, China is essentially want to use this control over critical minerals to showcase to particularly United States and also US's allies, not just Europe, but also the rest of Asia, just to see how much disruptions that China can bring, and hence would invite those countries very much more in line with China's view and visions of the world, and less so with United States. So in a way, whatever China does is still putting through that lenses on this competition with Washington.
James, how do you think that meeting might go?
I think it's very much as you just says. I think China has got pretty much a watertight stranglehold over the US by restricting rare earth exports. I mean, to me, the most crucial expression of this is with what's called heavy rare earths, many of which are used in making military equipment and weapons. China controls the supply chain almost totally in that regard. So the message to the Pentagon is if you don't back down, then China can make it very difficult for you to build the weapons that you need to defend yourself. So China's coming in really hard with this bargaining chip or this leverage. The US has its own leverage. It has a whole load of export controls and investment controls with regard to China. And it also knows that China really needs advanced semiconductors that the US makes. So maybe there is kind of the contours of a sort of deal in which China resiles somewhat on the rare earth controls, and the US agrees to make more of the advanced semiconductors available to China. But this is purely guesswork. We haven't seen that spoken about by the Chinese or the Americans so far. But if the two are going to reach a deal, it could be something along those lines. I happen to think that it's quite possible that the two will not reach a deal. I think that conventional wisdom is, at the moment, digesting the fact that a deal will be reached. But if you ask me, the emotions this time between the US and China are at such fever pitch that it may be difficult for them to reach at least a full deal. Perhaps it'll be some kind of partial deal.
I mean, it's not just the emotion. I have not seen any positive signals of this week from the Chinese state media to indicate that it's very much in favor of having a warm meeting between President Xi and President Trump. So really judging from all the political signals that's been given from Beijing's end so far, I do not see this event and this summit is something beyond a photo opportunity.
And James, if I've read what you're saying correctly, you think the US should reach a deal in the sense that it's in a much weaker position that it chooses to acknowledge.
I certainly think that the US is in a weaker position. I think that this is the first trade
Weaker
spat.
than China.
Weaker than China. I think that this is the first trade spat between the US and China that I can remember where the whip hand is clearly with China. It's rather amazing for me to be saying that, but I do believe that that is the case, particularly because of the leverage that China has over rare earth exports. How the US will react, will the US be in the mood to concede, what China thinks about that? These are all big questions. And as you just says, it doesn't look like the two sides are moving towards some kind of accommodation, at least right now.
And let me just extend that point into defense, because one of the points you've been making since you arrived at Chatham House, we're very glad you did, is that China's ahead in many areas of defense, even if the US chooses not to acknowledge that.
Absolutely. According to research by the ASPI, an Australian think tank, out of 64 advanced technologies, China is currently ahead in about 57. Now, this really turns the table in terms of technological power between China and the US. And I think that is being expressed in these, the tech war and the trade war that currently exists between the US and China. So we're into a really new world here. We're into a very new phase in the way that international relations are conducted. This is definitely something that is worth watching.
I mean, worth watching in a big way, in that all kinds of things, and I'm thinking just at the moment at the height of the American stock market, so much resting on not only the tech giants, but on the presumption of American innovation going on and on, all these things vulnerable. And the US, as its politics are at the moment, it's not suiting it to recognize perhaps those vulnerabilities, while it still reserves a fluency about how China is a threat. I want to ask you as well about the Middle East,
Sure.
because all kinds of countries are now getting involved in whether there is a settlement in
Sure.
Gaza and so on.
Sure.
China has plenty of contacts right through the region,
Yep.
but you don't hear an awful lot about it offering to help rebuild Gaza, though clearly it could play a part and so on. You don't hear a lot about it offering to mediate. Why is that?
Well, it's, again, very interesting. Beijing view its relationship through Middle East purely and simply on a commercial basis, and less so in terms of a security provider. And also, Beijing would like to use this opportunity to attack United States because Beijing argued that United States has been the single most important disruptor in the situation in the Middle East. And this actually gives Beijing a perfect opportunity to attack United States. So the more chaos that Middle East would have, and this Beijing would double down its rhetoric towards United States and on this criticism towards United States. So in a way, I think that's part of the reason why Beijing was standing there idly. Now, I think secondly, there's also coming to a very interesting element of the Chinese foreign policy, that sense of obsession about its own immediate neighborhood, but not necessarily somewhere far away. And I think Beijing has learned this from the United States very clearly by being a superpower, and that would require to draw itself into those conflicts that you're not very familiar with at all. And that's what America has done with the Middle East, and that's what America has done in Africa and also in other parts of the world in the past. However, China will do so by all means to avoid that.
What about Taiwan? We've come this far in the conversation not mentioning it, as one can, because it's not a live point of dispute compared to others, but it hangs there over any conversation. Do you think they can each agree sort of not to mention it now, or is it something both that the Chinese want to assert and the US feels in turn a need to assert what it believes?
Well, surely both sides have some kind of a gentleman agreement and hoping they will be able to continue that gentleman agreement. But whether within Taiwan, the mood is been pivoting towards mainland China or the mood has been pivoting towards independent is very unclear for the very moment. Now, really, if we come back to this plenary meeting, and I'll be very curious to see how they're going to describe the Taiwan issue when they come to the statement on Friday, and whether such a wording has had any substantive changes compared with the previous version when they met in July last year. If there's nothing changed, and that means the overall trajectory of the policy from Beijing won't change. But if there's any word which is missing, and that is indicate the party has concluded they might pivot into a different direction towards Taiwan.
The world's not awash in gentlemen's agreements at the moment. And all the extensive work we do on the emerging world order, that phrase tends not to feature. But you're looking for the status quo in language.
I'm looking for the missing words, and I'm looking for the missing people.
So let's come right back to the beginning. And I put in right in the start a question about the leadership itself. And on the one hand, we've been describing a picture of some confidence. And in James's portrait, one of considerable technological leads, a chokehold on this particular aspect of the trade wars over critical minerals and so on. Yes, some economic vulnerabilities, but they've been there for a long time. But we had this run-up beyond HR of expulsions, sackings, and now potentially lots of missing faces. How secure do you think the leadership feels?
Well, judging from all the senior military officials expelled from both the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, and the party, it actually indicates that Xi Jinping was in firm grip of his power in his hand, because he basically sacked all the people he promoted in the very beginning when he came to power, and then promote another new cohort of generals at the same time. So it's actually indicate he can really decide what he would like to do and who he'd like to be in that important position.
Right, it shows his power
It shows
to
his power.
get rid of people, but it doesn't show that he could use the continuity of these people he's been working with for years.
Well, I mean, it shows that he began to lose some confidence towards certain people he have chosen. But I would also be interesting to observe when they come out on Friday, are we going to have a new composition of the Central Military Commission of the PLA? Because for now, at the moment, the 3 spots are actually missing. If we are going to have 3 new additional members in here,
This is of the military commission.
this is on the military commission. So usually they're 7 in numbers, and we only have 4 permanent members for now. So if we're going to have another additional 3, and who these people are these people close confidant of President Xi himself, or are these people from some other factions within the party? So I think that will be a window display to show how much power and President Xi realistically have in his hand.
How much do you look at these faces coming and going? I'm not talking for the moment about the very top one, but about the others, and try and judge something about China's policy from it.
I mean, I think these days the sinology of China's personnel appointments is more about judging Xi Jinping's power base than it is judging differences in policy. It seems to me that basically Xi Jinping is in control. Whatever Xi Jinping wants goes. The people around Xi Jinping basically do what he says. What's interesting about, as Yujie calls it, these HR issues and the missing people.
I'm taking that as ironic. I would say.
Ironic. And the missing officials in crucial positions is what they might say about the huge machinations within the Chinese political system that, as outsiders, we really have very little idea about. But I always say, where there's smoke, there's fire. And if you're missing so many crucial officials from, let's say, the Central Military Commission, it shows that there have been major ructions within the corridors of power in Zhongnanhai, in central Beijing. More than that, I think we can't say. But it does certainly seem to me, at least, that looking at Xi Jinping at the moment, he looks confident. He seems to be in charge. You know, he's all over the next 5-year plan. He was there with Putin and Kim Jong-un in the recent meetings in northern China. So, yeah, I would say these issues of personnel really help us to try to understand what's happening at the center of Chinese power, but they don't tell us much about Chinese policy.
And Eugenia, for all the stories that have been flicking through international press, speculating on whether or not President Xi would be there for many more years or perhaps something shorter, it sounds as if there is no reason really to bring that into question at the moment. Or am I wrong?
You're not wrong. And I think no one knows. The
No one
truth is
knows.
no one knows at the moment. But one signal we could pick up is among the new cohort of the Central Military Commission members, if we're ever going to have a member who is civilian, that is means not on uniform, and that would potentially to be the successor of President himself. But I think that would be a wild card for now to putting that on the table.
Okay, well, with that, I think we're going to draw it to a close. But do look at our website, as our team is going to be commenting on this as details come out, as details don't appear, as Eugenia has been saying, and we'll be analysing all that and very much welcome people's thoughts as well on the significance of all these. We're going to have to stop there. Huge thanks to Eugenia, James Kynge, for joining me in this conversation. See you next week.